Welcome to Module 8. This week, our reading covered Chapter 14 and focused on some key ideas of Hobbes, Locke, and Berkeley. These thinkers are generally considered the early modern philosophers. By comparison with Socrates and St. Anselm and St. Aquinas, you should see why. Their approach to philosophy is radically different, and the kinds of ideas they are using are also entirely new. The chapter covered a lot of points, so I will instead focus on a few threads that run through them. We first turn to Descartes, whom we mentioned in the last video. You can read up more on him in the chapter 13 of your book. Descartes was an amazing thinker, and he introduced a number of critical ideas into Western thought, ideas you are using right now, even if you don't know it. The first idea we want to touch on is his notion that things should be viewed in terms of their quantities, not qualities. What he meant by that is that when we talk about the world, the part of the world we can actually agree on are the kinds of things that are measurable: height, weight, extension, mass, and so on. This approach of measuring and putting a number to things is called the quantitative approach. We may disagree about whether the table is fine or not, but we don't disagree about how much space it takes up. Since he was a mathematician, this kind of approach is both understandable, but also good to take, because it lets us have a shared set of metrics and make sure that we're not talking past each other. The issue that will arise is when we export this quantitative approach to non-mathematical issues. The second idea, arising from the first one, is that all things are merely made up of matter. Matter is quantifiable, and that makes it real in a way that leaves little or no room for disagreement. Whether this person is a fine person or not is up to debate. Their height is not. This approach of reducing everything to matter is called materialism. When coupled with the quantitative approach, it has great problem-solving power in many fields, but also has some unintended side effects. While Descartes was strongly religious and may not have intended his ideas to pan out as they did, the historical trajectory of his ideas has taken a turn towards a purely mechanistic view of the universe, the exact kind of thing that tends to sit at the core of atheism. This pattern of good ideas that do a lot of things they were not intended to do is a common one in philosophy. Let's look at the issue with materialism and the quantitative approach. Traditional conceptions of the world and sciences were interested in the qualitative approach, looking at the kinds of qualities a thing possessed and then sorting them in those sorts of ways. So chickens are the kind of thing that flies, lays eggs, can be domesticated, does not indicate higher cognitive functions, and is edible. Thus, we can eat chickens, morally speaking. I am not including the issues of factory farming, GMO chickens, and meat consumption. Humans are the kind of things that give birth to live young, live in societies, possess higher cognitive functions, have access to reason, and are not edible. That is, we cannot eat humans, morally speaking, because they are elevated as a species through those cognitive functions, etc. And again, I'm not including cannibal tribes in that statement. So we can see the difference between humans and chickens in terms of qualities. But when we take on the materialistic outlook and a quantitative approach, we get slightly different results. If we dissect a cow, what you find is brain, organs, muscles, bones, etc. The cow becomes only the materials it is composed of. In fact, you could break it down to something like 3 square yards of leather, 100 pounds of muscle, 100 pounds of internal organs, 120 pounds of bone, 20 pounds of tendon and sinew, and a brain. That is a cow by quantity. Now dissect a human being. 70 pounds of bone, 10 pounds of tendon and sinew, 30 pounds of internal organs, 50 pounds of muscle, and a brain. There's no difference here except in relative quantities. So how can we eat cows but prohibit eating people? Let's assume that we don't murder people for food. Why can't we eat the recently deceased? And then, why can't we breed people for food? It is inefficient, but that could be like a delicacy. You may be thinking, but what about human rights? The issue is, where would you attach those rights? Humans, quantitatively, are no different than cows, and we're not up in arms about cow lives matter. This is the problem of the quantitative approach and materialism. Humans are nothing more than another animal. While traditional societies thought that we were part animals and part transcendent because of reason, Descartes gives us the idea of humans as animals only because of quantitative materialism. And if we want to dig deeper, all things are made of atoms. So where would you attach some kind of a privileged position to this set of atoms over that set? You can even go subatomic and show that all things are perfectly equal. We are nothing more than protons, electrons, and neutrons. And that goes for you, for your dog, and for a rock. When you take on materialism and a quantitative approach, all sorts of things happen. You can do physics better because you are only dealing with the quantity part. But there is nowhere to attach ethics, so they go right out the window. Now we can make nukes, but there is no materialist reason to not use them. Of course, I am caricaturing this position a bit to get the point across. And certainly, as we shall see, the same kinds of ideas gave rise to Locke's political discourse, and that gave us the basis for Western democracy, so it can't be all bad. Why do we care about Descartes, though? Because his ideas were foundational in much of the philosophical thinking that played out in the early modern period. And you see these ideas come up again and again. So we need to be familiar with them if we're going to properly understand the other thinkers. Hobbes takes the Descartes idea of materialism and runs with it. The first thing he does is get rid of morality and the accompanying ideas of free will. If materialism is true, then humans are amoral, meaning that they are unconnected to the idea of morality. There is no good or bad in moral terms, only in the practical sense of your actions doing what you want them to do or not. If materialism is true, then you are nothing more than the sum of your parts. All the material parts are just stuff, and stuff behaves according to the rules of mechanics, which means that it is fully calculable. You and the rock are made up of the same stuff, ultimately speaking. There is no free will because there is nothing that has a will. Notice that this is getting rid of the kind of teleology that places reason as the purpose of human existence. The way we act is by seeking to do what we desire, and we only desire things we think are good, and all the things we think are good are things that give us pleasure or reduce our pain. You'll notice that this sets up a hierarchy of desires, and the way we decide between one thing and another is purely on the basis of the relative strength of the desire. Now you may be wondering how it is that we can desire something but not act on it. That's because there is a difference between desire and wishful thinking. For example, you may desire to get into shape, but if you don't actually act on that desire, if you don't hit the gym, it's not a desire, it's just wishful thinking. It's something like asking yourself, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I were in shape? This process is neat because Hobbes has found a way of demonstrating what people actually desire. We desire, as in really desire, those things that we act on. Everything else is either wishful thinking or a desire that is less powerful than the one that we are actually acting on. All this means is that we are fully animals, and animals have certain tendencies, like how they act if left alone. You can train an animal to do this or that, but as soon as you take away the threat of punishment or some hope of a reward, they act just like they always did, an animal. This is Hobbes' state of nature. A good example are the 1977 New York power outage riots. When the power went out, people took to spontaneously looting and rioting like barbarian hordes. You can also look at how a stable and civilized society reduces itself to nothing once someone cuts out the social standards, like when someone bombs a country and takes out its leadership. When the external restraints are removed, we act like animals off the chain. The state of nature, for Hobbes, is a war of all against all. It sounds grim, but is also surprisingly accurate. We are creatures with a number of needs and wants. The only way that those needs and wants get satisfied is if we invest resources into satisfying them. The problem is, there are only limited resources available, and so for every bit of resources I take, there are less resources for you to take. This is called a finite game or a zero-sum game. It works in the instances where the goods that we're trying to get are limited. So it's like a pie. There's only so much pie in this tin, and as I eat this piece, there is less available for you to eat. Our values hierarchy, for Hobbes, is all about satisfying our own needs. Each man for himself, and let the devil take the hindmost. While this lets us profit from the misery of others and gives us disproportionate gains, it also exposes us to disproportionate losses. Sure, I can rob you and get all of your hard-earned wealth, but then Bob can rob me and now I have nothing. We're not very happy about this. It would be great to act however I want with no consequences, but very few people are strong enough to really do that. On top of that, says Hobbes, in such a situation there is no society and no trade possible, because you can never rely on other people to do their job. The state of nature is chaos. So the solution is to look for a way to establish order. Note that as soon as we recognize the chaos, the first thing we want to do is establish order. We don't do this to be moral. We do this out of purely selfish motives for wanting to be safe. How do we do that? We trade in our do-anything option for a very restricted society, but one where the breaking of rules that are in place leads to punishment from the authority that has been placed above us. That authority is what Hobbes calls the Leviathan. It takes the place of the GHE in the society, and like the GHE, the Leviathan is always above the law, because he is the source of the law. He is also the source of reward and punishment, and this gives us a stable enough basis to form a society to be able to engage in trade, because if you cheat, now there is a referee that comes in and fixes the situation. Locke takes the quantitative materialism of Descartes, but goes in two different directions with it. Like Hobbes, he will talk about politics, but unlike Hobbes, he spends a great deal of time trying to work out how we think, how we know, etc. This is important because understanding how we think lets us fix mistakes in thinking, including those about our goals and about our beliefs. Locke insists that we have no inborn ideas and that all of our ideas are the construct of our experiences. This is also known as empiricism. You have basic sense impressions which you can combine into complex ideas. You can also see a sense impression across several different phenomena. So, a red apple, a red cherry, red algae. And thus, you can abstract out the idea of a redness. This is important because attributes like redness are not something that we can ever experience by themselves. A color is always a feature of something, like an apple, a cherry, or algae. But this gives us the ability to manipulate abstract ideas about incidental properties, which Locke calls modes. There is nothing that does not have incidentals attached to it. There is nothing without some particular color or shape or things of that nature. But the real thing that we are talking about is not dependent on these incidentals. There is a layer of a real nature of the thing which is under the incidentals, and that is the substance. Substance is what has shape and color. It is the thing that is smooth or rough or hot or cold. That substance has certain powers because it is what affects our minds when we perceive it. That's how we come to have the experience of oranges. But that orangeness is not a physical thing. It's an effect of the perceived entity. That makes orange, the color, an immaterial substance. Sounds weird, right? How do you have an immaterial substance, and how could you say anything about it? Well, qualities must be experienced. You can't talk about having an experience unless you have something that does the experiencing. Your experience of substances, or incidentals, have to have an effect on the part of you that can have ideas. That part is the soul, according to Locke. We know that we have a soul because we are always aware of ourselves. Or rather, we are never not aware of ourselves. We can't help but be aware because all other experiences and ideas are understood by the soul that we are. But that part of us is itself immaterial. So, according to Locke, we all have some experience of immaterial substances just by being ourselves. Thus, we all believe in immaterial substances, and so the immaterial substance of ideas makes sense. At least it does to Locke. But why do we care? Well, because Locke will use this set of ideas to develop his political theory, and that political theory is one of the most important influences on the U.S. Constitution. In fact, it's not a stretch to say that without the ideas presented by Locke, there would be no U.S. Constitution as we know it. For Locke, the idea of society and political association starts with natural law. Yes, that natural law that St. Aquinas wrote so much about. Locke builds the entire political framework on top of that. This is where you see that the religious ideas are at the deepest levels of modern societies, including non-religious societies, because so much of the framework they use to create themselves comes from ideas that are originally religious. The question for us is, what happens to that structure if you get rid of the religious reasons for believing these ideas? How do these ideas remain standing without support? Or maybe they don't, and all it takes is enough social inertia before the whole thing collapses. Through natural law, Locke argues that the role of the government is to restrain human selfish impulses of being partial to yourself and to your associates at the expense of others. This leads us into a social contract between the government and the people. Unlike the Hobbesian position, the role of the government can't be that of a Leviathan, the GHE-like entity, because no government can coherently have absolute power, at least not if it's built for the purpose that Locke is arguing for. The active point of the government and the social contract is to have the individuals invest their personal right to punish breaches of natural law into a central institution, which will then punish breaches of natural law impartially. And that institution will be governed by the majority rule and will apply to everyone alike. This means that the government becomes responsible for protecting the property of all individuals alike. And keep in mind that, for Locke, property includes life, liberty, and so on. But that would mean that we have some kind of inherent rights, and this would include the right to own property. How is that a natural right? Well, Locke says that resources that are generally out there belong to everyone. But if you do work on those natural resources, then your effort is what gives you an exclusive right to that resource, or at least the part of it that you have worked on. Water may be free, but if I go to the river and get some in my bucket, then that effort makes it my water in the bucket, and it becomes exclusively my property. This is part of what the government is there to protect. The interesting thing about Locke, who was religious, is that his experiences of the many problems of religious fights in Europe led him to develop a very neat solution to the issue of religious differences and gave us a theory of toleration. It's important to note that at the time, the religion of the ruler, who was almost always a king, was commonly forced on the people under that ruler's authority. And if you did not believe what the king believed, then you were commonly persecuted, often prosecuted, and sometimes killed for that difference. Locke here examines the ideas we have about religion, from his perspective on human understanding. He concludes that if we assume that two people are both fully honest and working as hard as possible to determine which religion is correct, they can still come up with different answers. That means that the choice of religion is not the kind of thing that we can know with 10 is greater than 3 kind of certainty. How does he know this? Because if you could know the truth of religion that way, then you could demonstrate it, and that would be the end of the conversation. But because there are still numerous religions around the world, we don't know which one is correct in that absolute sense. Now, you may feel certain for yourself, but if you can't demonstrate it, then that's not the kind of certainty that Locke is talking about. Additionally, Locke tells us that the state is supposed to deal with the natural law, which is universal by definition, and the preservation of that natural law. Religion, on the other hand, is a matter of personal and voluntary choice. See how these two ideas don't really overlap? The government can enforce laws about the kinds of beliefs that can be demonstrated. So, if you walk into a 7-Eleven and you buy a drink for $1 and you pay with a $5 bill and get no change back, the cashier can't say that he believes that 5 minus 1 is 0, and so you don't get any change. In fact, if that's what he tells you, you can call the police, and they, along with our judicial system, will punish the clerk and enforce our beliefs about math on him. As a result, Locke argues that it is incoherent for a government to force its religious beliefs on the people, because that religious belief is not something that can be demonstrated with certainty. And therefore, we must allow each person to arrive at their own conclusions about religion. Now notice how Locke here is using ideas that were presented by Ibn Masarra and by Al-Ghazali. He uses the idea of a rational assent to a religion and the ideas of certainty as the only thing that you can legitimately enforce upon other people. This isn't to say that Locke plagiarized, because as far as we know, he has not, but it is to say that these ideas about how a religion fits into a society were not weirdly understood by the people that we have looked at so far. In fact, these were the sorts of standard answers given. Finally, we get to Bishop Berkeley, and here we will only touch on one of his ideas. Existing is being perceived. Bishop Berkeley argues that the whole point advanced by Locke about substances and abstractions is flawed beyond belief, and instead he takes a different approach. He says that when we talk about something existing, what we mean is that a thing can be experienced with our senses. This means that all we know comes down to just two elements: the mind, which is what experiences things, and the idea of the thing, and that idea is in the mind but is caused by sensations. We can't talk about things existing on their own because we don't know anything like that. Everything that exists is a thing that can be experienced by someone or at least has the potential to be experienced. There is nothing else. You can't talk about something existing apart from someone who is experiencing it, because how would that even work? If you're thinking, but what about things no one has experienced yet? Bishop Berkeley would tell you that it either has the potential to be experienced, or it does not exist. What would it mean for a thing that can't be experienced to be located in a place where no one could ever get to it? How could you say that something like that actually exists? In what way would you think it existing? A thing exists is something that we experience and sense, and it's those sensations that tell us that a thing exists and how it exists. But without those sensations, we can't talk about existing because we have nothing to talk about. All our ideas are always in our mind. We can't reach out and get an idea in any other way. We know ourselves immediately because we are constantly experiencing ourselves. We know everything else indirectly by experience. We know other people indirectly, and we take certain actions that they do and that we experience to be a sign that their self is likely to be like myself, along with the intentions and such. But our experiences are generally not man-made. Most of our sensory experience is of the natural world. Now, nothing can create itself, so something else had to make the natural world, and again, it can't be man-made. Things only exist if they're perceived, so something else, not man, must be perceiving the world. For Bishop Berkeley, this is God. Bishop Berkeley's ideas have, over time, taken on an entirely different role. His necessary connection between experience, the object, and the person experiencing it, the subject, have become a staple of a lot of modern ideas. How we understand fields of study like history, for example, is dependent on who wrote it. So it's not just the objects of history, but the interpretation of those objects that creates a particular picture of history. There is no perspective where the knower is not part of that interpretation. That is a 20th century secular philosophical idea, but it grew out of Bishop Berkeley's arguments. This kind of context lets you see how arguments morph over time, and how ideas that were intended for one purpose can be appropriated for another. This is why it matters to read religious philosophers, who were the only kind of philosopher in the West for well over 1,000 years. It's not because you're supposed to care about their proof of God, but because you're supposed to understand the kinds of arguments that they present, so that you can draw on that type of argument for your own purposes. Our second reading for the week is called Man's Nature is Evil, and it is one of the most interesting and influential pieces of Chinese philosophy by the last of the classical Confucians, Xunzi. If you pay attention, you will notice that his approach, some 2,000 years earlier, is almost identical descriptively to the one offered by Hobbes. They're both interested in the nature of human nature, both see it as less than wonderful, and both use it to springboard a conversation about the political implications of such human nature. It should be noted that human nature is a key component in getting your political theory right. No matter how good the theory is in abstract, if you misidentify human nature, the whole thing collapses in practice. This is because any political structure depends on the behavior of the average person within that system. If your assumption about the average behavior is wrong, everything that rested on that assumption becomes wrong. This is one of the critical issues that led to the communist collapse. Marx had misidentified the base behavior of humans and had built his system on false assumptions of how people would behave. It's no wonder that the system couldn't last. First, let's identify what Xunzi means by the phrase, human nature is evil. Human is easy enough to understand, and so is the word is. It simply means to be. Nature, in this context, refers to the general human predispositions and applies to the overwhelming majority of human beings, but not necessarily all. So for example, human beings are the kinds of things that have 2 legs and walk upright, but there are people without one or both of their legs who do not walk upright. These kinds of extreme case exceptions are excluded because Xunzi is focusing on the general meaning here. Evil, we have to remember, does not mean the kind of moral evil we are used to thinking about. Xunzi is Chinese, and so he is using that definition of evil that is part of the Chinese context, not the Western one. For him, evil means something like subpar performance, wasteful behavior, actions that are not viable in the long term because they are not sustainable and they are not harmonious with the nature and the nature of people. For a detailed analysis of the term, you can read the article we covered on China. This idea of evil is always contextual and rarely, if ever, deals in absolutes. Note that good nature would mean something like general disposition of the average human being towards acting in a harmonious manner, which would be sustainable and viable in the long term, which would not be wasteful, and which would carry out the optimal decisions in the context of our actions and the context of our resources. So why is human nature evil? Xunzi gives us a series of arguments using a number of analogies, historical examples, and logical arguments. We'll cover a few here. 1. If human nature was good, there would be no need for laws, enforcement, or education, because we would simply do all those kinds of things on our own. But as soon as the threat of force by enforcement of law is removed, a lot of people simply go off the chain. And you can see this play out across college campuses, when kids find themselves without the sanctioning presence of their parents and suddenly turn into animals. And this means that our nature cannot be good by default. Second, if human nature were good, people could simply be left alone and they would develop into the kinds of individuals that are socially functional, contributing members of society. But we don't even pretend to do that. Instead, we know that we must socialize children into proper ways of social behavior, or else they will be permanently off the chain. You have to be taught not to use streets as a toilet, not to bite people, to communicate your status to others, etc. This means that we, as a society, mandate that children be trained, and that training makes no sense if you're naturally disposed towards those behaviors, but only if you would otherwise behave in ways that are contrary to these social values. And that's why you don't need anybody to teach you how to walk, you will figure it out on your own. So why are we evil? Because the path of evil is the path of least resistance. It is far easier to live for the moment. However, without investment, dedication, and sacrifice of today for tomorrow, these short-term benefits lead to your own destruction and the destruction of the society. So you can get instant gratification and bliss by consuming any number of drugs. But getting that instant gratification now leads to some not so happy future prospects. Ultimately, the problem with the acts of evil is that they are all about instant gratification, because that's easy, it's direct, and everyone can, by default, understand that, even squirrels. But through education, we teach people the concept of investing and sacrificing now, and delaying their gratification until the future. We do this because delayed gratification is the way of investing in the future. It's a way of making sure that the future will be stable and orderly, or at least doing it as well as we can. Think about it this way. You could spend your entire paycheck on the kinds of things you want right now, and you will be happy right now. But the odds are that this kind of spending will pretty quickly lead to a serious problem. You won't have money to pay rent, gas, food, or something else that's critical. People get laid off all the time. If you have just one accident of any kind, your whole life comes crumbling down. Now, if you had saved some of that portion of your income and not enjoyed it when you earned it, then you would be much better suited to survive the kinds of accidents that life throws at you. And so, saving now is delaying the gratification of that money until some future time. But it makes you much more resilient over the long term. And this is why we have education, so that people learn to look beyond their immediate experiences and instant gratification, and instead make sacrifices for their future. A society of stable individuals is likely to be a stable society, and stable societies prevent things like mass death, destruction, and chaos. Xunzi is all about getting these core ideas squared away and getting a handle on the nature of human nature. If we can do that, it becomes much easier to design the kinds of social systems that will help us establish and maintain functional societies and keep the people as a whole happy.